Did you know that according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, the primary source of funding for most state wildlife conservation efforts is paid for by hunters? In order to hunt legally, a hunter must pay fees, and the majority of that money goes straight back into wildlife conservation, providing wildlife with better habitat and better living conditions. Hunting is one of the most important things for maintaining our wildlife populations and habitat. Hunting provides the majority of funds for state conservation efforts, and without it, we wouldn't have money to maintain our wildlife areas and keep them as good as they are. Conservation, by definition, is the prevention of a wasteful resource, which is why hunting is regulated and it's not legal to just go out and shoot a bunch of deer. In order to deer hunt, you have to go out and purchase a hunting license, then you have to buy a deer tag for the amount of deer you would like to shoot that year, and for every season you would like to hunt that deer. All of these funds go directly back to the state organizations that pay for wildlife refuges, state parks and public lands, etc. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, through just the Pittman-Robertson Act, hunters have contributed over $14 billion to conservation since 1937, and that is through just one act that has been put into place. Thousands of more dollars have been contributed to conservation by hunters through many different routes. Next, I will talk about how hunting maintains a healthy wildlife population. Hunters that hunt ethically and legally are one of the main reasons for our wildlife populations being so productive and abundant as they are today. Without hunting, there would be a boom in game populations. Let's use deer as an example. If all deer hunters were to just stop hunting altogether, the lack of deer being killed off would result in more deer breeding, which would result in a much larger number of deer being born the next year. Due to our agricultural industry being so big, the deer feed on a lot of the crop fields that farmers plant. According to Warren R. in 2011, the boom in the population would lead to more feeding on farmers' fields and causing a lot of damage to them. The more deer means the less food there is to go around, so the less food an organism gets, the more unhealthy they tend to be. Worse health can eventually lead to disease, and that itself can lead to a huge die-off of a population. Even if that does not happen to them, an area of land can only hold so much of a species before that species runs out of resources, eventually killing them off via starvation. Deer also share the same resources as many other animals too, so it's not only hurting them, it's also hurting other species that share the same area. And I'll hand out this graph. Okay, so I have a graph of the U.S. deer population from 1450 to 2017. In 1450, the deer population was just under 45 million, and slowly, as more and more people settled in the U.S., the numbers went down, 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 and eventually, around 1900, the population got all the way down to right around 1 million. And during that time period before 1900, nobody was thinking very conservation minded, and there wasn't any restrictions on how much you could shoot or how many game you could get. There wasn't any seasons or anything. And then right after around 1900, we started thinking more conservation minded, and President Roosevelt, set a bunch of laws and stuff in place, and eventually our population got back up, and now it's right around, or in 2017 it was right around 35 million. Finally, I will discuss how hunting helps protect the habitat for wildlife. According to the U.S. Department of Interior, hunters pay for the upkeep of state parks and wildlife refuges, like I mentioned before. Hunters provide the money for creating all of these beautiful places, not only for wildlife, but to give people the chance who may not be able to experience the outdoors otherwise. In each of these wonderful places paid for by hunters, thousands of organisms thrive as they have some of the best living conditions for wildlife anywhere. The reason for the conditions of these places being so pristine is because the habitat and wildlife can only be managed and can be properly managed in those areas. The organizations that create these places put in proper cover, food, and waterways and areas for the species that live there. Without proper resources for these living species in these places, they would overcompete for resources, and habitat would eventually run out, like I mentioned above. In conclusion, In conclusion, hunting helps to keep populations of game animals in a good range, helps to keep their habitat healthy, and helps provide places for humans and animals to roam. Hunting is an important part of keeping our wildlife healthy, their habitat healthy, and nature in general healthy. As long as humans have existed, uh, they have been hunting, and it is helping to keep our wildlife as strong and abundant as ever. It's important we continue to teach people about the good hunting does for the environment so that we can continue to keep wild game and their habitats thriving. Because without it, then uh, wildlife would eventually, like wild game wouldn't be near as good as it is now, and they would eventually die off, and it wouldn't be good. Thanks for listening.